The Viking Age lasted around 250 years. It stretched from the burning of monasteries on the English coast all the way to the founding of states in what's now Russia and Ukraine. And historians argue about when it ended, because history doesn't cut itself into neat pieces. But the date most of them settle on is the 25th of September 1066. They settle on it because it's the day one man died in a field in northern England, and the argument goes that once he was gone, there was nobody left who could do what he did. His name was Harald Sigurdsson. The world remembers him as Harald Hararda, a nickname that translates to something close to hard ruler, or severe, or tyrant, depending on which scholar is doing the translating. A German churchman named Adam of Bremen, who wrote about the north, while people who'd actually met Harald were still walking around, call him the Thunderbolt of the North. Now, the Middle Ages had no shortage of frightening fighters, and other names come up whenever people argue about who the most horrifying warrior of the whole period was. Ivar the Boneless led the great heathen army into England, and according to legend, he executed a captured king by opening his ribcage from behind, though historians still argue about whether that method of execution ever happened outside of stories. Subutai, the Mongol general, conquered more territory than any commander in history, and military schools were still studying his one-sided campaigns in the 20th century. John Hawkwood spent 30 years squeezing money out of Italian cities with an army for hire, and his troops murdered peasants and dismembered their enemies, while he collected a salary bigger than some governments. Those are strong candidates. But each of those men mostly worked one arena and one kind of war, and Harald worked nearly all of them. He fought in Norway and Sweden and Russia, and then on almost every frontier of the Byzantine Empire, which means the Mediterranean, Asia Minor, Sicily, Bulgaria, and maybe the Holy Land, and then in Denmark for 15 years, and finally in England. He was a teenage soldier, then a mercenary, then the commander of an emperor's bodyguard, then a king, and then an invader. He kept it up for 36 years because the man never once retired from fighting. This is his whole story, told in order, and the nice thing about it is that none of it needs exaggerating. Harald was born in Ringerike in eastern Norway in 1015 or possibly 1016, because records from that time don't allow more precision than that. His father was Sigurd Syr, a petty king in the uplands, and petty king is the correct term here, because Norway at the time was less a single country and more a collection of little kingdoms with a stronger king, sometimes sitting on top of them. Sigurd's nickname, Syr, appears to mean sow, as in the pig. The usual explanation is that he loved farming and rooting around in his own soil, and that fits because Sigurd was a quiet, careful, wealthy man who managed his farms personally and stayed out of trouble. Harald's mother was Osta Gudbrandsdatter, and through her, Harald was the youngest half-brother of Olaf Haraldsson, who had already made himself king of Norway and who would later become Saint Olaf, the eternal patron saint of the country. The later sagas claim the family descended from Harald Fairhair, the legendary first king who unified Norway. But most modern scholars think that genealogy was invented about 2 centuries later to make the dynasty look better, and it's telling that nobody in Harald's own lifetime ever seems to have brought it up. The sagas say young Harald was different from his 2 older brothers. Those 2 were down-to-earth farmers in the mold of their father, and Harald was a rebel with big ambitions who looked up to his half-brother, the king. He got his chance to prove it early and in the worst possible circumstances. Olaf had made plenty of enemies in Norway, partly because he pushed Christianity on people with methods that included torture and killing, and partly because he pushed the nobles harder than they were willing to be pushed. So in 1028, the Danish king, Knut the Great, who already ruled England and Denmark, backed a revolt that drove Olaf out of the country. Olaf went east into exile, and in 1030 he came back over the mountains with a scraped-together army to take his kingdom back. Harald was 15 years old, and he gathered 600 men from the uplands and marched them to meet his brother. According to some sources, Olaf told the boy to stay in the camp, but Harald talked him into letting him fight. The two sides met at a farm called Stiklestad on the 29th of July, 1030, and it became the most famous battle in the history of Norway. Snorri Sturluson, the Icelandic writer who set all this down about 200 years later, says Olaf's men shouted forward, forward, men of Christ, men of the cross, men of the king, and the farmers' army facing them shouted, forward, forward, farmers. The numbers Snorri gives are almost certainly inflated, and modern historians think both armies were smaller and more thrown together than the saga makes them sound. But the outcome isn't in dispute. Olaf took a wound in the knee, then a spear thrust up under his mail shirt and into his belly, and then a cut to the neck, and he died leaning against a large stone, and his army broke. Harald fought on his brother's side that day, and observers remarked afterward that the 15-year-old had shown considerable military talent. He was also badly wounded, and the only reason he lived was that locals took him in and hid him, and they didn't know the wounded teenager was the dead king's brother. A nobleman named Rognvald Brusason got him away to a remote farm in eastern Norway. Harald stayed there until his wounds healed, possibly for as long as a month, and then he traveled north over the mountains into Sweden. His brother was dead, his family's cause was crushed, and Norway belonged to Knut. The future most feared warrior in Europe was a wounded 16-year-old refugee with nothing. He didn't stay a refugee for long. A year after Stiklestad, Harald and the men who'd stuck with him arrived in Kievan Rus, the sprawling state that Norse settlers and Slavic tribes had built along the river roads of Eastern Europe and which the sagas call Gardariki. He likely passed through the old trading town of Staraya Ladoga in the first half of 1031, and from there he came to the court of Yaroslav the Wise, the Grand Prince of Kiev. Yaroslav was about as well connected as a ruler could be in that century, because his wife was a Swedish princess and a distant relative of Harald's, and his daughters would go on to marry the kings of France, Hungary, and Norway. He was also badly in need of military men, because his state was fighting Poles and steppe nomads and rebellious tribes more or less constantly. So Yaroslav looked at this tall Norwegian teenager with battle experience and royal blood, and he made him a captain in his army. One of the old texts says Yaroslav embraced Harald first and foremost because he was Saint Olaf's brother, and that's believable because Olaf had sheltered at this same court during his own exile. Harald fought in Yaroslav's campaign against the Poles in 1031 and probably also against the Jutes in Estonia and against the Pechenegs, the nomad people who raided the southern borders. He spent a few years learning war in a part of the world where war never stopped. He also fell for the boss's daughter, which is a thing that happens in every era. Her name was Elisiv, or Elisaveta, and she was Yaroslav's daughter and the granddaughter of the Swedish king. One source says Harald asked for her hand during this first stay in Kiev and got turned down flat, because a landless exile on a captain's pay wasn't a serious match for a princess whose sisters were being married to the kings of Europe. Nobody knows if the story is true, but if it is, it explains a lot about what Harald did next, because what he did next was go get rich in the most direct way available to a Norseman in the 11th century. Around 1033 or 1034, Harald and a force of about 500 men sailed south to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. The city the Norsemen called Miklagard, which just means the great city. And here you gotta realize what Constantinople was to these people. Norway at the time had no cities at all worth the name, and Constantinople had somewhere around 500,000 people, and stone walls that had never been taken, and gold in quantities that Northern Europe found hard to believe. In that city, there was a unit called the Varangian Guard, and it was the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine Emperor, and it was made up almost entirely of Norsemen. The arrangement had started back in 988, when the Emperor Basil II got 6,000 Norse warriors from Prince Vladimir of Kiev. Basil decided he trusted foreign axemen more than his own countrymen, because the foreigners had no local political loyalties and no stake in palace intrigue. Their track record backed him up, because when these men pursued a beaten rebel army, one chronicler noted that they cheerfully hacked them to pieces. The guard fought with broad-bladed, two-handed axes, and Byzantine writers mostly didn't even call them Varangians. They called them the axe-bearing barbarians, and one described them attacking with reckless rage, caring nothing for their own blood or wounds. Service in the guard paid better than anything else a Scandinavian could do. Young men were leaving Sweden for Constantinople in such numbers that one Swedish province wrote a law saying nobody could inherit property while they stayed in Greece, because too many heirs were just gone. Harald joined the guard, and he rose quickly. One saga claims he tried to keep his royal identity secret at first, but most sources agree his reputation traveled ahead of him. And within a couple of years, Snorri calls him the leader over all the Varangians. Whether he held a rank quite that grand is doubtful, and the Byzantine records suggest his official titles stayed fairly modest. But there's no doubt about where he went and what he did, because a Greek book of advice written in the 1070s mentions Araltes, which is Harald, and confirms the outline of his service. He fought Arab pirates in the Mediterranean, and then inland towns in Asia Minor that had supported the pirates, and by 1035 the campaigns had carried him east as far as the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia. His own court poet later claimed Harald took part in the capture of 80 Arab strongholds. Normally, a number from a court poet is worth very little, but two modern historians who studied his Byzantine career saw no particular reason to question this one. He probably also traveled to Jerusalem, though the reason is disputed, and the version historians find most likely is less dramatic than the sagas make it sound. A peace treaty between the empire and the Muslim ruler of the region had just allowed Byzantine workers to repair the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and Harald's trip was probably escort duty for pilgrims and church officials, with maybe some fighting against the bandits who preyed on travelers. The sagas turned that into a conquest of the Holy Land, because that's what sagas do. But escort duty in a dangerous country was respectable work, and it means the same man stood guard in Jerusalem who had bled at Stiklestad. In 1038, the empire launched its big project, the reconquest of Sicily from the Arabs. Harald and the Varangians went along under the command of a general named George Maniakes, who the sagas call Girge. Maniakes was popularly said to be almost a giant, extremely tall and built to match, and he was talented and successful and impossible to work with. The campaign gathered a strange collection of fighters, because alongside the Varangians there were Norman mercenaries from France, including a man called William Iron Arm, who got that nickname by beating the Emir of Syracuse in single combat. The army took Messina and then Syracuse, and Snorri credits Harald with capturing 4 towns on the island. The saga versions of those captures include tricks such as pretending to be dead in order to get a funeral procession inside the walls, and those tricks are almost certainly borrowed legends. But the campaign itself was going well, and the empire came close to holding the whole island. Then it fell apart, and for reasons that had nothing to do with the enemy. Maniakes publicly humiliated the leader of his Lombard troops, and the Lombards deserted, and the Normans followed them, and the insulted allies went back to Italy and raised a revolt against the empire in 1041. Harald and the Varangian Guard were sent to fight the very Normans they'd fought beside, and this time it went badly, because the Normans won at Olivento in March and again at Montemaggiore in May. Those defeats were among the first signs of a change that would matter enormously later, because the Normans were becoming the best fighters in Europe, and everyone would find that out soon enough. Maniakes, for his part, got recalled and imprisoned after a quarrel, and the Sicilian conquests dissolved. A few years later, he declared himself emperor, marched on Constantinople, and died from a battle wound just as his army was winning. That was the caliber of person Harald spent his 30s around. From Italy, the guard was pulled east, because something bigger had broken loose in the Balkans. The empire had conquered Bulgaria a generation earlier, and in 1040, a Bulgarian named Peter Delian proclaimed himself emperor of a restored Bulgaria. The revolt spread across the whole region, and rebel armies pushed all the way into Greece. The rising went well for the Bulgarians until it ate itself. Delian's cousin, Alusian, arrived from Constantinople, joined the revolt, botched a siege that cost 15,000 men, and then settled the leadership question at a dinner where he waited until Delian was drunk and cut off his nose and blinded him with a kitchen knife. Alusian then sold the whole revolt out to the Byzantines and was rewarded with a court title, and the blinded Delian, incredibly, went back to commanding his army anyway. The Emperor Michael IV, a sick man whose legs were visibly rotting from dropsy, personally led the imperial army north, and Harald and around 500 Varangians marched with him. In the late summer of 1041, the army met the Bulgarians at Ostrovo and destroyed them. The sagas hail Harald's part in that victory in a very direct way, because they gave him a new nickname, the Bulgar Burner. They also claim it was Harald who cut the blind Delian down on the field, and while that detail can be confirmed, a short Bulgarian chronicle seems to lend it some support. By his poet's count, Harald had now fought in 18 major battles in imperial service, and the empire gave him honors and respect when he came back to Constantinople. If the story had stopped there, he'd already have had a fuller military career than most kings in Europe. He was 26. Then Byzantine palace politics caught up with him, and Byzantine palace politics in the 1040s could kill a man faster than any battlefield. The Empress Zoe had already gone through one husband, the Emperor Romanos, who was found dying in his bath under circumstances that most of the court considered a murder, and she had married her young lover Michael the same day the body was found. That was Michael IV, the same Emperor Harald served in Bulgaria. In December 1041, Michael died of his illness, and his nephew took the throne as Michael V, and the whole structure of favor and protection that Harald had operated under started to wobble. During the turmoil that followed, Harald was arrested and imprisoned, and the sources can't agree on why. The sagas say he was charged with defrauding the emperor of treasure, and also that he'd asked to marry a noblewoman, and the empress refused because she wanted Harald for herself. That second part is almost certainly a saga invention, but the money charge sounds fairly plausible, given how much treasure had been passing through Harald's hands. An English chronicler says he was locked up for defiling a noble woman, and a Danish one says it was for murder, and a modern historian has suggested the new emperor may just have feared a Varangian commander whose loyalty belonged to the old one. The record allows all of it. nobody knows for sure. What happened next is one of the stranger episodes in the empire's history. Michael V banished his adoptive mother Zoe, and the city of Constantinople rose against him, because Zoe was the legitimate heir of an old dynasty, and the people were not having it, and the fighting killed around 3,000 people. Somebody got Harald out of prison in the middle of all this, and one text says a rich Byzantine widow rescued him. However it happened, Harald came out of his cell and straight into the uprising, and he didn't sit it out, because while some Varangians kept guarding the emperor, Harald became a leader of the Varangians who backed the revolt. The emperor fled to a monastery and clung to the altar, and he was dragged out anyway, and his eyes were put out. And here's the detail that stays with people, because the sagas claim it was Harald himself who blinded Michael V, or at least claimed to have done it. The Byzantine eyewitness accounts don't name the man who wielded the iron, and one modern argument holds that the whole attribution is legend. But blinding was the standard Byzantine penalty for deposed emperors, and Harald was an officer of the guard responsible for exactly this kind of work. So, the most level-headed reading is that it happened under his supervision as a duty, and the sagas then moved the iron into his own hands. Either way, a farm boy from Ringerica had just taken part in unmaking an emperor of Rome, and a poem about him blinding an emperor was apparently circulating within his own lifetime. Now you gotta realize what Harald had been accumulating this whole time, because this is the part that set up everything after. Varangian pay was already excellent, and the spoils from 18 battles came on top of it. On top of that, the sagas describe a custom they call Polutasvarf, or palace plunder, under which the Varangians had the right, when an emperor died, to run through the imperial treasury and carry away whatever they could grab with both hands. Byzantine sources never mention this custom, and modern historians doubt it worked anything close to the way the sagas describe. But the sagas insist Harald took part in it 3 times, and 3 emperors did in fact die during his service, and something certainly filled his ships, because throughout these years Harald kept shipping his wealth north to Yaroslav in Kiev for safekeeping. However, he got it. By 1042, Harald was, by the standards of Northern Europe, staggeringly rich. That mattered, because in the 11th century, a crown was something a man could substantially buy, since silver paid for ships, and ships carried soldiers, and soldiers made kings. With Zoe restored alongside her sister, and a new emperor named Constantine installed by marriage, Harald asked permission to leave the empire. The answer was no. Experienced commanders with his influence over the Varangians were not the kind of asset the palace liked to release, so he left anyway. He took 2 ships and some loyal followers and slipped into the strait at night, and the Byzantines kept a great iron chain stretched across the water exactly to stop this kind of exit. Harald ran both ships at it, and the story says he ordered every man, not at an oar, to run to the stern with all the cargo, so the bows rode up onto the chain, and then to run forward, so the ships tipped over it. His own ship made it into open water. The second ship broke its back on the chain and went down with the men aboard, and that ratio, 1 ship through and 1 ship lost, is about as honest a summary of serving under Harald as the record offers. And here's the strange part, because the same Greek book that recorded his service says Harald maintained loyalty and love toward the empire for the rest of his life. Even as a king, he apparently kept up contacts with Constantinople, and years later he'd import Byzantine habits into how he ran Norway, right down to telling a meddling archbishop's men that he knew of no lord of Norway other than himself, words a Norwegian historian later said could have come from a Byzantine despot. Harald sailed the Black Sea back to Kiev in 1042 and collected the fortune he'd been storing with Yaroslav. This time, nobody turned down his marriage proposal, because during the winter of 1043 to 1044, he married Elisiv, the princess he'd been refused a decade earlier. He'd even written poetry about her during his years in the south, and one surviving verse complains that the goddess in Gardariki will not accept his gold rings, which is a Viking way of saying she was out of his league. Now she wasn't. It's worth noticing who else was marrying Yaroslav's children in those years, because one daughter became Queen of France and another became Queen of Hungary, and the son married the Emperor of Byzantium's daughter. Harald's inclusion in that family shows exactly what a decade of Varangian service had turned him into. Shortly after he arrived, Yaroslav launched an attack on Constantinople, and it's considered likely that Harald supplied him with detailed information about the state of the empire's defenses, because loyalty and love toward the empire evidently had its limits. In early 1045, Harald started for home. He went from Novgorod to Staraya Ladoga, got a ship and sailed through Lake Ladoga and down into the Baltic. One of the court poets claims his ship rode low and unbalanced in the water because of the sheer weight of gold aboard, and poets exaggerate, but the general picture was true enough. The Norway he was returning to had changed while he was gone, because Knut's sons had let their grip on the country slip, and the throne had gone to Magnus the Good, the illegitimate son of Saint Olaf, which made Magnus Harald's own half-nephew. Magnus had been a boy king, and he'd grown into a well-liked one. After the Danish king Harthaknut died, Magnus had become king of Denmark too, and he'd been beating back a Danish claimant named Svein Estridsson. So the situation Harald walked into was this. His nephew held two kingdoms, both thrones traced back to Harald's own family, and there was no obvious spot for a returning uncle with a fleet full of gold. Harald's answer was blunt. He sailed to Sweden and joined forces with Svein, the very claimant fighting his nephew, and together with the Swedish king, they started raiding the Danish coast, because the point of the raids was to show the Danes that Magnus couldn't protect them. It worked the way rich men's threats usually work. Magnus's advisors were against fighting his uncle, and in 1046 the two struck a deal under which Harald would rule Norway jointly with Magnus keeping precedence. In exchange, Harald would share half of his treasure with Magnus, who was king of two countries and broke. The co-rule was tense and cold, and the two kept separate courts and mostly avoided each other, and the sagas say their few meetings nearly ended in brawls. It lasted barely a year, because in 1047, while campaigning in Denmark, Magnus suddenly died. The accounts of how disagree, because one has him falling overboard from a ship, another has him falling off a horse, and another has him just falling sick. But before he died, he supposedly settled the inheritance, and the settlement drew the map of the next 20 years, because Svein was to have Denmark and Harald was to have Norway. Harald, now sole king of Norway at around 31, wanted both. He declared himself king of Denmark as well and prepared to invade, and the Norwegian army essentially refused, because the chieftains, under a leader named Einar Tambarskelfer, insisted on carrying Magnus's body home to be buried beside Saint Olaf instead. Einar summed up the mood in one line, because he said that to follow Magnus dead was better than to follow any other king alive. Harald backed down and buried his nephew, and it's a fair guess he never forgot who made him do it. What followed was one of the longest and most pointless wars of the century, and telling it plainly means admitting up front that it achieved nothing. Harald wanted to rebuild Knut's old North Sea Empire, which had joined Denmark, Norway, and England under one crown, and step one was taking Denmark from Svein. So from 1048 onward, Harald raided the Danish coast almost every single year for about 15 years. The raids were swift and violent, and they worked in the narrow sense that Harald won most of the fighting, and they failed in the larger sense because winning raids never got him Denmark. The most infamous of them came in 1049 or 1050 when Harald attacked Hedeby, the greatest trading town Denmark had, among the best protected and most crowded towns in all of Scandinavia, a place where silver and silk and slaves from 3 continents changed hands. Harald burned it to the ground. The burning was thorough enough that Hedeby never recovered as a town, and when looters picked over what was left some years later, the place was finished for good. 1,000 years later, archaeologists found the charred remains of Harald's fire ships lying on the bottom of the harbor. One of his own skalds bragged about it in verse, singing that all Hedeby was burned from end to end out of anger, and calling it a valiant deed, and describing high flame bursting from house after house while the poet stood on the rampart before dawn. A town that had stood for 250 years was gone in a night because one king wanted to hurt another. And that's the reason the Danish town of Schleswig exists today, because the survivors moved across the inlet and started over. There's a story from around the same period, recorded in the sagas, that shows the same man in an even colder light. Harald's ships were heavy with loot and captives from a raid on Jutland, and Sweyn's fleet was catching up, so Harald ordered the plunder thrown overboard, guessing the Danes would stop to fish their goods out of the sea. Sweyn ordered his men to ignore the cargo and keep rowing. So Harald threw the captives overboard instead, and for them Sweyn stopped and Harald slipped away. It's a saga story, so the details can't be trusted line by line. But nobody who compiled the traditions about Harald seems to have found it out of character. The one great set-piece battle of the Danish War came at sea, at the mouth of the river Nisø, on the 9th of August, 1062. Harald had gotten tired of raids that decided nothing, so he arranged a formal battle with Sweyn ahead of time, at an agreed place and date, which was a thing kings could do then. When Sweyn's fleet didn't show, Harald sent home the farmer half of his forces and kept only the professionals, and that's when Sweyn appeared with around 300 ships to Harald's 150. The fleets tied their ships together into floating walls, and the fighting started in the evening and went all night, and Harald spent the early part of it shooting with his bow. By dawn, the Danish line had come apart, and 70 Danish ships were left, in the saga's phrase, emptied of men. A large share of the credit belonged to an earl named Hakon Ivarsson, who'd kept his ships loose on the flanks and attacked wherever the Danes weakened. And everyone, including Harald, hailed him afterward as the hero of the battle. Sweyn's own ship was taken, but the man himself went into the water and got away. There's a saga scene where he turns up that night, unrecognized, at the house of a peasant couple, and the wife scolds the stranger for hogging the hand towel. And the king answers mildly and moves on, and the couple was later rewarded with land for the kindness. The battle was a clear Norwegian victory, and it was also the same result as always, because Sweyn escaped and Denmark didn't fall. 2 years later, in 1064, the two kings finally made peace, with no reparations and no land changing hands. 15 years of burning and killing, and the border ended up exactly where it started. And you gotta understand that this outcome, this expensive nothing, is what pushed Harald toward the decision that ended the Viking Age. Because a king who had spent his whole reign failing to take Denmark needed a bigger prize to aim at, and there was one sitting right across the North Sea. The peace with Denmark also closed the books on the men at home who'd crossed Harald along the way, because his reign inside Norway ran on the same fuel as his wars outside it. This is the period that actually earned him the name Hardrada, and the nickname came from how he treated his own aristocracy. The main opposition was the old family of the Earls of Lade, who had run northern Norway with a lot of independence for generations, and their leader, by then, was that same Einar Tambarskjálfr, who'd blocked the invasion of Denmark. Einar knew what kind of king he was dealing with, and at one point he arrived at Harald's court in Nidaros, accompanied by 8 or 9 longships and almost 500 men, which is a way of saying something without saying it, and Harald let the display pass. Then, at a later meeting, and the sources differ on the circumstances, Harald's men killed Einar, and they killed his son along with him. The murder came close to tipping Norway into civil war, and Harald negotiated his way out of it, and the family that had checked kings for a century was finished as a power. Hakon Ivarsson, the hero of Niso, went the other way. Harald had floated the idea of making him an earl and then backed out of it, and Hakon ended up in Swedish service, raising the uplands against Harald, and Harald marched into Sweden and beat him. That revolt gave Harald a reason to turn on his own people, and this may be the most honest picture of the man that exists, because there's no saga glamour on any of it. The farmers of the uplands had withheld their taxes, so through the winter of 1065, Harald went through the region the way he'd gone through Denmark, burning farms and small villages, maiming men and killing men as a warning to anyone else who might hold back what the king was owed, and he confiscated rich farming estates as he went. The campaign rolled through Romerike and on into Hedmark, Hadeland, and Ringerike. Ringerike is where he was born, the district his quiet pig farming father had managed so carefully, and Harald burned through it because the people there had shorted him on taxes. By the end of 1065, there was peace in Norway, and the sources are fairly plain about what that peace was made of, because the opposition had been killed, chased out of the country, or scared into silence. On the other hand, and it feels strange to say about the same man, Harald was in several respects a good king, and historians point out that his years on the throne were a time of peace and progress for ordinary Norwegians who paid their taxes. He put the minting of coins under a royal monopoly and built Norway a working coin economy, which pulled the country into international trade. He ran trade connections to Kiev and Constantinople through his old friendships, and to Scotland and Ireland as well. Tradition says he founded the town of Oslo, which grew up to be the capital of the country. He kept building churches, and he imported priests and bishops from the east, from Rus and Byzantium. And when the Archbishop of Hamburg-Bremen sent legates to complain that Norway's church answered to him, Harald sent back the reply about knowing no lord of Norway other than the king. He also seems to have gotten curious about the edges of his own world, because Adam of Bremen, writing at the time, describes Harald taking ships out into the northern ocean and searching it until, in Adam's words, he had before his eyes the dark failing boundaries of the savage world, and barely escaped the abyss to come home. Nobody knows how far that voyage went. One modern historian even suggested Harald may have been looking for Vinland, the land across the Atlantic that Norse sailors had reached a generation or two earlier, and that's speculation, but it's the kind of speculation the man invites. As for what he was like, the descriptions come mostly from Snorri, writing 2 centuries later, so the details are shaky, but the tradition is consistent. He was said to be bigger and stronger than other men, 5 ells tall by the most generous account, with light hair and beard, long mustaches, big hands and big feet, and one eyebrow set higher than the other, which is a wonderfully specific thing for a tradition to remember about a face. He composed poetry his whole life, and a scholar of the sagas judged him the only Norwegian king who showed a decided talent for it. He kept Icelandic poets around him and treated them well, because he cared about how he'd be remembered, and poets were the ones who did the remembering. One poem credits him with mastering rowing, riding, swimming, skiing, shooting, brewing, harp playing, and poetry, and the sagas mention his Varangians once pausing a siege to hold sports, which suggests where the habit came from. He had 2 wives, more or less at the same time. Alongside Elisif, he took Tora Thorbergsdatter, the daughter of a powerful Norwegian family, in around 1048, and historians have puzzled over the arrangement, and some have argued Tora must have counted as a concubine, but only Elisif held the title of queen. A churchman would have had notes about all this, but in Norway, nobody was in a position to give the king notes about anything. By 1065, then, the ledger stood as follows. Harald was around 50 years old, undefeated in a career running back 35 years, secure on his throne, rich, and feared from the Irish Sea to the Bosphorus. He was also out of wars to fight, because Denmark had beaten him by surviving, and Norway had no rivals left alive. A sensible man winds the story down there. And then, in January 1066, Edward the Confessor, King of England, died without a child, and every ambitious man in Northern Europe heard the same door swing open. Harald's claim to England rested on paperwork, and old paperwork at that. Back in the 1030s, his nephew Magnus and the Danish king Harthacnut, who was also king of England, had agreed that whichever of them died first without an heir, the other would inherit his lands, and Harthacnut had duly died childless in 1042. England had gone to Edward the Confessor instead, and nobody in England had ever taken the Scandinavian claim seriously. But Magnus had held on to it, and when Magnus died, Harald took over the claim along with the kingdom. For most of his reign, it stayed theoretical, because a king at war with Denmark couldn't also fight England, and Harald seems to have understood that clearly. By 1066, though, the Danish war was over, and Edward was dead, and the English council had crowned Harold Godwinson the most powerful earl in the country. Within a day of Edward's death, there was a second claimant across the channel too, because Duke William of Normandy insisted the throne had been promised to him. 2 kings named Harold and a duke named William, all claiming one island, and the year 1066 was going to be spent sorting it out. The man who tipped Harold into acting was Tostig Godwinson, and Tostig deserves a minute, because without him, there's probably no invasion. Tostig was the new English king's own brother. He'd been Earl of Northumbria for 10 years, and he'd governed it harshly, with murders of leading local men, under safe conduct and taxes the region wouldn't bear. And in 1065, the North rose against him, killed his officials, and demanded his removal. His brother Harold, reading the situation, sided with the rebels, and Tostig was outlawed and exiled, and he never forgave it, because at the royal council he publicly accused his own brother of engineering the whole thing. From exile in Flanders, Tostig went shopping for a patron, and he seems to have tried nearly everyone, because the sources have him approaching William in Normandy and Sweyn in Denmark, and finally Harald in Norway. One saga describes him working on a decidedly unenthusiastic Harald, which rings true, because Harald had just spent 15 years learning what invasions cost. On the other hand, Tostig was offering things nobody else could. He knew the terrain, he claimed support was waiting in the north of England, and he was the King of England's brother, which made the whole project look less foreign and more legitimate. Harald agreed. Through the spring and summer of 1066, he assembled a fleet at Solund, near the mouth of the Sogne Fjord, and the traditional figure is around 300 ships, and modern estimates put the army somewhere between 7 and 15,000 fighting men. The preparations tell their own quiet story about how well Harald understood the risk. Before sailing, he had his son Magnus proclaimed King of Norway and left him home to rule. And he took the other son, Olaf, along with him, and he brought Elisif and their 2 daughters as far as Orkney, and he carried his royal treasure aboard the fleet. That's a man arranging his affairs both ways, so that either he'd be King of England or his line would survive him. The fleet crossed to Shetland and then Orkney, where the island earls joined with their men, and at Dunfermline he met the King of Scots, Malcolm, who was Tostig's friend, and by one account picked up around 2,000 Scottish soldiers. In early September, the combined force met Tostig and his dozen ships at Tynemouth and turned south down the English coast. They raided as they went, and at Scarborough, the town refused Harald's demand to surrender, so he burned it down, and after Scarborough, the other towns of the coast stopped arguing. The fleet pushed into the Humber estuary and up the river Ouse, and on the 20th of September, the army came ashore at a village called Ricol, within striking distance of York, which was the capital of the north and a city with plenty of Scandinavian blood in it, because it had been a Viking town within living memory. The Earls of the North, Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria, the same Morcar who'd replaced Tostig, didn't wait for their king to come up from the south. They met the invasion at Fulford, on the outskirts of York, on the 20th of September, and they anchored one flank on the river and the other on a swamp, and they attacked first. The attack made early progress against the weakest part of the Norwegian line, because Harald's army was still arriving and he'd put his greenest men on that side. Then the veterans came up, and Harald swung his best troops through the center, and the English line bent back into the marsh, and the men caught between the river and the swamp had nowhere left to retreat. The battle was a decisive Norwegian victory, and the armies of Mercia and Northumbria were cut to pieces as fighting forces, though both earls got away, and York opened its gates to Harald within days. Fulford deserves to be more famous than it is, because it turned out to be the last time a Scandinavian army defeated an English one, the end of a run that had started at Lindisfarne almost 300 years earlier. Harald took hostages and supplies, agreed to spare the city, and arranged a follow-up meeting for the 25th of September at the river crossing east of York, where hostages from the whole shire would be handed over and the running of the north would be settled. The place was called Stamford Bridge. Now you gotta realize what the situation looked like from the Norwegian camp in those last few days, because it looked finished. The northern army was destroyed, York had surrendered, and the north country was full of people with Danish grandfathers. The other English king, the one with the actual army, was far away in the south waiting for William of Normandy to invade, and no army in anyone's experience could be in both places in the same month. Harald had every reason to believe the campaign was over except the paperwork, and that's the only way to explain the decision he made on the morning of the 25th. He split the army, left a third of it with the ships at Ricol, and marched the rest to Stamford Bridge to collect hostages. And because the day was hot and they expected a crowd of civilians, the men left their mail shirts at the ships and marched with shields, helmets, and weapons only. What Harald didn't know was that Harald Godwinson had heard about the invasion, gathered his housecarls, and force-marched an army about 185 miles from London to Yorkshire in 4 days, traveling day and night, picking up levies as he came. On the morning of the 25th, that army came straight through York without stopping, because Harald had left no garrison in the city, and nobody rode ahead to warn the Norwegians. Right up until the English came into view, the invaders had no idea a hostile army was anywhere near them. Then Harald stood at Stamford Bridge and watched a force arrive that was heavily armed, fully armored, and much bigger than his own, while his men's mail shirts lay in the ships 16 miles away. Before the fighting started, the sagas record one last conversation, and historians consider it invented. But it earned its place in the tradition. So here it is with that warning attached. A single rider came out from the English lines and spoke to Tostig, and he offered him his old earldom back if he'd abandon the Norwegians and rejoin his brother. Tostig asked what his brother would give King Harald of Norway for his trouble. The rider answered that Harald would get 6 feet of English ground, or 7, seeing as he was taller than other men, and then he rode back to his own lines. Harald, watching him go, asked Tostig who the man with the fine speech was, and Tostig answered that it was Harold Godwinson himself, the King of England, come out to bargain with his own brother in person. Invented or otherwise, that exchange is how England chose to remember the day, because the whole battle is in it, and so is the size of the man it was aimed at. The English attack was held up, according to English sources rather than Norse ones, by a single Norwegian at the bridge over the river Derwent, a big man with an axe who stood on the narrow crossing and killed more than 40 Englishmen, one after another, while the army behind him scrambled into formation. Nobody could get past him. In the end, an English soldier floated under the bridge and drove a spear up through the planks and under his mail shirt, and that opened the crossing. The delay let Harold form his men into a shield wall, and then the main battle started, and it was never close, because the English had armor and numbers, and the Norwegians had shields and whatever the morning had left them. Harald went into the fighting the way the sagas say the old warriors used to, in the state they called Berserkergang, out in front of the wall, no mail shirt, holding his sword with both hands, cutting men down while the battle fury was on him. It lasted until an arrow took him through the throat early in the battle, and that was the death of Harald Sigurdsson, 36 years after Stiklestad. The fighting ground on until Tostig was dead too, and then, late in the day, the men from the ships arrived, because word had reached Rikol and Eystein Ore, who was promised to Harald's daughter Maria, had let the ship guard 16 miles at a run, in full armor, in the heat. Some of his men collapsed and died on the road, without ever seeing the battle. The ones who arrived found Harald's fallen banner, the one he called Landwester, and Eystein raised it and charged straight in. And the Norse tradition calls this last push, or race, storm, and for a moment it came close to bending the English line. Then Eystein was killed, and the storm broke, and the army that had won at Fulford 5 days earlier stopped existing. The survivors ran for the ships with the English behind them, and some drowned crossing the rivers. And the chroniclers wrote that 50 years later, the battlefield was still white with bleached bones. Harold had crossed the North Sea with a fleet of around 300 ships. The English let the survivors go home after they swore never to attack England again, and the survivors needed 24 ships. The sagas add that Maria, Harold's daughter, died on Orkney on the very day of the battle, the same day her father and the man she was promised to were both killed. That detail is beyond checking, but somebody clearly felt the story needed it, and it's hard to blame them. The one man who got something out of Stamford Bridge held it for exactly 19 days. Harold Godwinson had destroyed the most feared warrior in Europe and annihilated his army, and 3 days later William of Normandy landed on the south coast. Harold force-marched his exhausted army all the way back down the length of England, and on the 14th of October he fought his second great battle in 3 weeks at Hastings, and he was killed, and England fell to William. Historians widely point to the Northern Campaign as a main reason Hastings went the way it did, because the army that faced the Normans had already burned its strength marching to Stamford Bridge and back, and some of the best fighting men in England were dead in Yorkshire. So there's a case to be made that Harald Hararda, by dying, decided who would rule England for the next 1,000 years. Within a month of Stamford Bridge, England belonged to William, and the Normans were themselves the descendants of Vikings who'd settled in France a few generations earlier. And so the age that had started with longships at Lindisfarne ended in a single autumn, in 2 battles fought 19 days apart. Norway itself was fine, and that's its own comment on Harald, because the country he'd hammered together didn't fall apart when he died. His son Olaf sailed home with the survivors, shared the throne peacefully with his brother Magnus, and later ruled alone for another generation, and Norway under Olaf was so calm that he's remembered as Olaf the Quiet. No Norwegian king ever seriously attempted the island again. The old claims, the Danish one and the English one, and the dream of the North Sea Empire, all of it died with Harald at Stamford Bridge, and his death is the event most often used to close the whole era, though a few Scandinavian expeditions straggled on for decades afterward. A year after the battle, Harald's body was carried home to Norway and buried in the Mary Church in Nidaros. About a century later, the body was moved to a monastery outside town, and in the 1600s, the monastery was torn down and the grave was gradually forgotten. In 2006, on the 940th anniversary of his death, a Norwegian newspaper looked into what had become of the site. The answer is that the last resting place of Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, commander of the Varangian Guard, burner of Hedeby, and the man whose death closed the Viking Age, is reportedly underneath a road that was built across the old monastery grounds. The city of Trondheim briefly considered digging him up and moving him into the cathedral with the other kings, and a month later the plan was quietly dropped, and the traffic still runs over him today.